on, man, the light's green. Just go already. This week on the Knowing God podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Knowing God. I'm John.
And I am Caleb Rowland.
And we are having part 2 of a discussion we started last week on digitizing church. And as you could tell, this conversation is going to be about, let's just green means go. We're going to utilize every tool that we have in this new world called the internet and digital world. And so let's go, let's use all these tools.
Exactly. You know, I mean, when you're sitting at a stoplight, there's two kinds of people. When there's somebody in front of you and the light turns green, there's the person who, once it's been green for 0.6 seconds, you're laying on the horn like, get out of the way and go, right? And there's the other person who's like, well, I'm from the South and I don't know, I'm just waiting. Bless your heart. Maybe, you know, they're having a hard day, get out of the way kind of deal, right? And you're kind of like, wait, like probably too long, and then you finally like, beep, beep, like, come on, guys, let's go. So we're talking about the green lights this week. And, last week was the red lights. So people who just say technology is kind of scary. You know, technology kind of corrupts what we have as far as the church and what God has intended the church to be. But then we also have people on the complete opposite end who says, every ounce of technology, anything that can be implemented, anything that we can be innovators and early adopters of, let's do that as soon as possible. As soon as we have it in the budget, let's make it happen so that we can be on the cutting edge, right?
Yeah, it's not, it takes here's what we can do to here's what we should do.
Right.
You know, like these are the new tools, and why wouldn't we use these new tools? Let's use these without really any sense of discretion or wisdom, or, we're just gonna go.
Right, no holds barred.
No holds barred. And I do think that this is maybe the attitude that causes the red light people to really go red.
Right.
And they say, whoa, this is moving way too fast, way too quickly, and we're not comfortable with this, and so we want to go back to the 1970s, we want to go back to maybe the 1980s, right?
Pink carpet, something like that will be good to go.
Exactly. And so, and I think there is this perspective in church especially that I find to be really interesting. Change is scary. Change is not something that comes normative to a lot of people. They like to avoid change. But, we live in a world that's ever changing.
Correct.
And we realize that. And so I think there sometimes is this tendency in the church that, well, everything else can change. The way I get my TV can change, streaming services. Blockbusters don't exist anymore except for that one in Oregon.
Right.
But don't change my church, right? Because this is comfortable. And so I think that can make that red light really, really red. And then it can also cause maybe some frustration with the green light people as they kind of look at those red light people and say they're obsolete, they're dinosaurs, they don't care, they're not reading their Bibles, whatever. And so we have to kind of live with that tension, I think.
We definitely do. But as we move into the green lights, we see that probably one of the most cutting edge things that we see now is, the metaverse.
Yes.
We know that, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, they're pouring, billions of dollars into the metaverse and into developing virtual reality technology. And we've seen that become really kind of, the rich kid who had the really nice gaming computer. He had, one of the, Oculus headsets.
Yeah.
And then you'd go over and be like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then you'd be like, I never really, feel the need to do that again. To now, a lot of people are beginning to implement that, to have some type of online presence in the metaverse with avatars and those different kind of things. And so with that, then of course, we have the question of what about virtual reality church? What about, setting up churches and gathering places in now virtual reality spaces?
Yeah, there are pastors, and I can't remember their names. I think there's one in California. We were watching some videos on this online.
And Life Church, I think they have a virtual reality brand now.
Yeah. So, but there are pastors exclusively who see themselves as pastors in a virtual reality environment. So yes, you don your Oculus goggles, you join into the church, there's a church service, there's a sermon, there's all the things that you would expect, there's even baptisms in the virtual world. And so, there are some people that say this is a new space, let's go, let's utilize it. And I think at the beginning, as we think about this, we need to say that this is such a departure from what we've understood and recognized as church. There are some aspects of this that are exciting. There are also some aspects of this that honestly kind of feel a little hokey to me, at least. And anytime I can go to church in an avatar.
Right, dressed like a penguin or whatever it is.
Yeah, so this is really in its infancy. And we don't exactly know the direction that this is going to go, but we have seen a lot of things in the past that have been kind of pioneered and kind of pinned as this like brand new, like world-changing thing. I remember a few years ago, like 3D televisions were a thing, and you had to wear goggles, or not goggles, but like glasses to watch. And you can't even find those anymore.
Right.
And that was a thing.
Exactly. Didn't hit. I mean, it's like, how long can Dippin' Dots be the ice cream of the future before it's the future and we still have ice cream and, Dippin' Dots you can only find at the ballpark or at the mall, right? I mean, so it's one of those things of like, is it actually going to take off? Is it actually going to be everything that it's billed to be? Or is it going to be a flop? And I think that's the question right now about the metaverse, right? I mean, even with all of this investment, with everything that's going on there, there's no signal whether it's actually going to be there in 5 years.
Yeah.
Whether in 5 years we're going to see it and we're going to say, wow, those guys really, they had the right idea of reaching out to people in the metaverse and of doing it that way. Or whether in 5 years we're going to be like, remember whenever people thought we were all going to be walking around, like with goggles on and living our lives online, and then that's just not where we're at.
Yeah. I think that one of the benefits of this VR church phenomenon that we're seeing is that it does connect people in different ways from around the world in real relationships. They have conversations with people, and it's just in a digital environment. Now, I'll just be the first to tell you, I haven't done this. I haven't experienced VR church. I don't really have any interest. VR goggles kind of make me a little nauseous.
Right.
It's not an environment that I really prefer.
Right.
But we do know that there are some people, maybe with some degree of social awkwardness, social anxieties, or maybe just health issues,
right,
that this is a real thing. And
absolutely,
it can be helpful.
Right, and so as we look at that, then we see that there's just the principle, in green lights that the church has always used technology to spread the gospel. Right, whether it's we look at the Roman road system, that Paul traveled to get from one place to another, that would have been completely impossible. Maybe 200 years before that. As far as falling into robbers, trying to make it from one place to the other, trying to make speedy travel, like that would have been very difficult. I mean, even ships, and being able to make ocean travels of, being able to take the gospel to far away lands, and more recently, even most people watching the podcast, regardless of your age, if you're older, you probably remember, ordering cassettes, right, of different pastors' sermons. You would have them send you cassettes so that you could have, whoever's series on the book of, 1 John, or, that they would ask, for CDs later on. And so we go through that and we see that the church has a long history. This isn't something that is just coming up, wow, how are we going to deal with technology? But from radio programs to watching Billy Graham on TV to cassettes to the roads, we see that technology has been a part of the church for a long time. And the church has adopted many of these avenues to great effect and great gospel witness, right?
This church has utilized a media ministry, or did. That was a big part of this church. In fact, we have this archive that goes back, I think, into the 1960s. And they were all converted cassette tapes. It's actually a really neat thing that we have. It's really a beautiful archive of just what God has done through this church in the past. But that's a good example. And that technology shifted, where it went from cassette to now digital. And hopefully the digital is a lot more long-lasting than a cassette tape.
Correct. But just to say that with, where we don't know where VR might be going, we do know that there's been other technologies that maybe people were worried about. Should we really be on the radio? Should we really be on TV? And then now we look back and we say, some of those things, the Reverend Billy Graham's funeral here a few years back, and just his outreach and how much effect that had had. And prisoners who, could never actually go into a physical church building, for the most part, who said that they came to Jesus through Billy Graham's ministry, carrying his coffin, those different kind of things. It was just one of those very impressive things. So
kind of moving along too here, and kind of in that same point, the Bible does not address digital gatherings. Just say, yeah, of course, there's no such thing as in the first century.
Right.
But the Bible doesn't address a lot of things that we do in the church.
Correct.
Like air conditioning.
Right. Sound systems. Projectors, to be able to get most people who are older have a hard time reading a hymnal now. Yeah. Ironically, it's so they don't have large print hymnals most of the time. It's really small, and so it's like, wow, I can't actually read this. But when you put the words up in giant letters on the screen, they say, wow, I can actually read that. But that's a technology that the Bible doesn't talk about specifically.
Another point that somebody might make is if you look at church membership, can it not be achieved digitally almost 100%? And we might say, well, I don't know. Maybe not. But there are a lot of things that can be achieved in a digital environment for healthy church membership.
Right.
Especially if you are equating attendance, digital attendance with in-person attendance, and those are one and the same, and you're thinking, then yes.
Right. And in some ways, we talked about giving. You can give online, right? That there's a digital giving platform that you can serve in some ways online. There's definitely some different ways of mentorship. You can even, my wife is a counselor and she does some, digital counseling sessions, those different kind of things. So there are ways that you can serve online, and we would say that for somebody who has that necessity, and I think that could also be true for somebody who maybe has that preference in some ways.
Yeah. Another point, we talked a little bit about this last week, taking the Lord's Supper. When we were in the COVID environment and everybody was shut down and, kind of stuck in their houses, I think most churches did some sort of, I would say not all, but most churches did some sort of, digital Lord's Supper. And so if you would take the stance that, okay, for the green light folks, they would say, well, why is it so bad now?
Right.
But it wasn't bad then.
Correct.
What has changed?
And even, if you look at, the Catholic Church who views, baptism very differently and communion very differently, there were some priests who were actually using water guns. From a distance during COVID to baptize babies, and you're kind of like, oh, that seems, like if you can baptize somebody with a water gun, then can you do it online? So I think there's some real questions there, because we realized that because of the world that we live in, there's some limitations that different people have for different reasons, and how can we make accommodations for those people?
Yeah, so those that are kind of on the green light side are just like, let's make those accommodations.
Exactly.
There are people on the other side of that device. There are people on the other side of that screen. Let's move forward. And that's kind of what the VR movement, I think, is really all about. It's really a missional, perspective.
Correct.
Maybe going back to that first point on VR Church, another real plus, I would say, for a VR environment is how much cheaper it is to plant a church.
Right.
Now, there are those on the other side that would say, is it really a church? But for those that are advocates of the VR church, they would say, yes, it is a church, and we don't have to have a building. We don't have to have, the sound systems that usually come with these buildings. We don't have to have, the electricity to pay for the light bills and so forth.
Correct.
And we don't need all these rooms for small groups. Like, we can do these virtually. And so those are kind of some interesting thoughts.
They are. But whether we're talking about virtual reality or whether we're even just talking about, utilizing more of the internet, of streaming, of doing all these different things, we do realize that the internet is the biggest third space in history.
Yeah.
Right. Whenever we talk about third spaces, so as a church planter, that's one thing we always look at. Your first space is, your home, and that's, where you spend a lot of time, and then your work. So where is that space between home and work where people spend a lot of time? In the past, it's been a lot of different places. Right now, maybe you're a baseball family and the ball field is your third space. You're always there.
Yeah.
If you're not at home and you're not at work, you're at the ball field, and you're there all summer and you're there all fall, and that's where you're going to be. But the internet is, again, a huge third space of where whenever people get off work and they go home, a lot of people spend a considerable amount of time on the internet. That is a third space where you can interact with people who you may not see normally at the grocery store, who you may not see normally out at sporting events or out in different ways of the community, but you would find them on the internet.
Yeah, gosh, man, that's such a good point. And so much so too, to especially what we saw during COVID from the work from home, kind of push. People were working from home long before COVID, but now I think there's more of a familiarity, maybe an acceptance that this is a legitimate way to earn a living. And so that is the third space kind of invading that second space of work, And so then the question would be, is from the church practitioners, why wouldn't we be active in that third space?
Correct.
Why would we neglect that?
And then the next question about that would say, well, if we're engaging with them, are people who are engaged digitally actually less, part of the church than people who are in person?
Yeah.
And we would ask that question about, for example, shut-ins, or people who have health issues. And we would say, well, would we tell somebody, who was in the hospital, constantly in the hospital, maybe they have, severe health issues, or that they're, immunocompromised, and so they can't come to church. Would we tell that person, you're great, but you're not really as much of a member as somebody who comes in person?
Yeah.
So many of those people, I know people who pray constantly, and prayer is a ministry of the church. They engage, we've talked to people who are like, I've watched every single one of your church services online since you went online in COVID. Yeah. And you think, I know almost nobody who's come in person every single Sunday since COVID, right? I mean, so you're thinking like, wow, there's a lot of engagement there. And so we have to ask the question too of, does it mean that you are less engaged just because you're online?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think too, I know as a pastor, when I preach on Sunday morning, I know where people sit. They typically sit in the same place. I also know those that are kind of drifting and a little sleepy every single Sunday. It doesn't matter what I'm talking about, how I'm doing it up there. And so we want to make sure we don't have this thought in our mind that in-person means engaged, online means disengaged or distracted. That doesn't necessarily mean that. And so, but does that green light mean then that everything needs to be ported online? I mean, I think that's kind of what we're asking.
Right.
And those that are online are going to be more engaged. Well, not necessarily so either.
Right, so. Exactly. And so we'll hit this last point, and actually next week we're going to talk about where we land. I mean, we were open and honest about that we're kind of more in that technology is amazing, but I wouldn't call us, the early adopters of the brand new cutting edge technology. But at the same time, we want to utilize technology that works in real ways. And so, but as we look at these green lights, I think there is one more question that's really good to ask, and that's, how do we gauge when somebody should just be coming to church? If that's the red light mentality of like, if you're at all possible, then you should be coming to church. Well, right now gas is almost $5 a gallon.
That's a good point.
And that's a real consideration for some people.
Boy.
You know what I mean? Whenever you look at different people who, even my wife and I, were doing great by the grace of God, that makes a big dent in our budget. Just gas to get to and from work. So if you're talking about, you need to be here every time that the church doors are open, you're talking about, maybe several $100s by the end of the month in gas money. And are you telling people that like, hey, if you can engage digitally one time in the week, you shouldn't do that because it's more valuable to be here in person?
Yeah.
Where are those breakover points? How sick do you have to be before we don't expect you to be at church anymore? How far away do you have to live before we're like, okay, you finally get a pass? I think there are some really, like we talked about, gray areas, right? There's going to be some messiness that we're just going to have to live with and have a lot of grace in to say that technology does reach people who really need it. And sometimes trying to decipher those people who we would like to put in those neat categories of really need it and are just being lazy, they're not that clean.
No, they're not. Yeah, no, they're not. People are not that cleanly divided into these different categories. We know that as pastors, and I think our churches need to be wizened up to that too.
Exactly. So as we look at this next week at the yellow lights, the categories of where we say we can approach with caution, we need to look both ways before crossing the street, but we also want to make sure that we are utilizing technology for the spread and the share of the gospel. That's what we're going to look at this next week. So we hope you join us for that episode of Knowing God.
All right, thanks.